A luxury jet hums through the clouds. A confident millionaire sips champagne, smirking as he watches a black mother struggle to calm her little boy beside him. He mutters insults under his breath, enjoying her discomfort, but suddenly a voice crackles over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit." The cabin freezes in shock, and then the same woman the millionaire mocked stands up, calm, composed, and ready to save everyone on board. The sky stretched endlessly outside the airplane windows as the flight from New York to London climbed above the clouds. Inside the first-class cabin, soft jazz played over the hum of engines, and the scent of expensive wine drifted through the air. Reclining in seat 2A was a millionaire whose presence seemed to command attention. He wore a tailored navy suit, a gold watch glinting under the cabin lights, his every movement filled with the quiet arrogance of someone used to being admired. As he scrolled lazily through his tablet, sipping champagne, he glanced to his left and frowned. Sitting beside him was a black mother in modest clothes, her curly-haired son perched beside her, his eyes wide with wonder as he pressed his face to the window. "Look, Mama, we're flying above the clouds," the boy whispered excitedly. His voice, filled with innocent joy, caught a few smiles from nearby passengers, but not from the millionaire. He rolled his eyes and muttered just loud enough for others to hear. "Looks like economy passengers lost their way." A few passengers chuckled awkwardly, pretending they hadn't heard, while the mother froze for a moment. She turned toward her son, smiling gently to keep him calm. "That's beautiful, isn't it, baby?" she said softly, choosing grace over confrontation. The millionaire smirked, taking another sip of champagne as if her calmness amused him. He leaned toward the passing flight attendant, lowering his voice, but not enough to hide his tone of irritation. "Excuse me, are you sure she's supposed to be in first class? Maybe there's been a mistake." The attendant blinked, surprised by the question. "She's right where she belongs, sir," the woman replied with polite firmness. "She has a confirmed seat." The millionaire raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, and turned away with a scoff. The attendant walked off quickly, her face tight with discomfort. The mother took a quiet breath, her fingers gently rubbing her son's hand. She could feel the sting of humiliation burn beneath her skin, but she refused to show it. Years of experience had taught her that some battles weren't worth fighting with words. Instead, she focused on keeping her son comfortable, distracting him with the view and stories about where they were heading. Her voice stayed calm, patient, and full of warmth, everything the millionaire beside her was not. But his disdain didn't stop. He side-eyed her every time her son spoke too loudly, every time she asked the attendant for water, every time she adjusted her seat. At one point, the boy accidentally dropped his small toy car, which rolled under the millionaire's foot. The man picked it up between two fingers as though it were something filthy and handed it back with a forced smile. "Maybe keep his toys under control," he said curtly. The mother nodded quietly, her expression unreadable, though inside her heart tightened. Her son whispered, "Sorry, sir," in a small voice. But the man didn't even acknowledge him. The mother gently placed her hand on her son's shoulder and whispered, "It's okay, sweetie. Some people just forget how to be kind." She leaned back in her seat, opening the small case resting on her lap, a sleek black pouch that held a polished stethoscope and a few neatly packed tools. The millionaire's eyes flickered toward it, his curiosity mixing with condescension. Probably some fake nurse kit, he thought with a smirk, turning his attention back to his tablet. He had no idea that the same hands holding that stethoscope had once treated soldiers in combat zones, had saved pilots mid-flight, had worked on missions where seconds meant the difference between life and death. As the flight continued, the mother stayed quiet, her posture composed and her expression serene. Her son eventually drifted to sleep against her shoulder, and she brushed his hair back tenderly. The millionaire, meanwhile, tapped away on his tablet, calculating profits and ignoring the people around him. His confidence was thick, his self-importance absolute. He looked out the window and muttered under his breath, "People should really know their place." The words slipped out with the same casual cruelty that had defined him for years, a habit born from privilege and ignorance. What he didn't know, what no one in that cabin yet understood, was that life was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. Because within the next few hours, the air of superiority that surrounded him would crumble at 30,000 feet, and the very woman he dismissed as out of place would soon become the only person capable of saving every soul on that flight, including his own. An hour had passed since the flight left New York, and the first-class cabin had settled into quiet luxury. The hum of the engines blended with soft conversation and the gentle clinking of glasses. The millionaire leaned back comfortably, scrolling through stock updates on his tablet, while the black mother beside him read a storybook to her son, her voice warm and soothing. The boy giggled softly, pointing out the clouds through the small window. Everything seemed calm, peaceful, and perfectly under control, until it wasn't. Without warning, the plane shuddered violently, lurching to one side. A few passengers gasped, and glasses toppled, spilling drinks onto designer suits and silk scarves. The cabin lights flickered, and the calm hum turned into a sharp buzz of anxiety. The millionaire frowned, annoyed rather than alarmed. "Unbelievable," he muttered, gripping the armrest. "Can't they fly straight?" The flight attendants hurried down the aisle, their smiles replaced by practiced professionalism. "Please fasten your seatbelts," one of them instructed. "We're just hitting a little turbulence." But this wasn't a little turbulence. The plane jerked again, stronger this time, making luggage compartments rattle and passengers grip their seats. The boy clutched his mother's arm, his eyes wide with fear. She calmly placed her hand over his, her tone steady and gentle. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just breathe with me," she whispered. Her voice carried a kind of calm that even the attendants noticed. She guided her son through slow breaths, her eyes never leaving his face. Around them, panic was growing, whispers, prayers, nervous laughter. The millionaire sat stiffly, pretending not to be afraid, but glancing anxiously at the overhead bins as if they might burst open any second. The captain's voice came over the intercom, a little strained but still professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." For a moment, everyone relaxed slightly, but then the voice cut off mid-sentence. A crackle of static filled the cabin, followed by silence. Seconds later, the co-pilot's voice replaced it, sharper, tense. "If there's any passenger with medical training on board, please come to the cockpit immediately. This is an emergency." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. People froze. A woman gasped. Someone whispered, "Did he say emergency?" The attendants exchanged quick, worried looks. The millionaire's heart started to beat faster, though he didn't show it. His eyes darted around, scanning faces, waiting for anyone to stand up. But no one moved. The entire cabin seemed paralyzed, the only sounds the trembling engines and a baby crying in the distance. Then, from the quiet, a single voice broke through. "Stay here, baby. I'll be right back." The black mother unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements calm but deliberate. Her son grabbed her sleeve, scared. She knelt beside him, placing a kiss on his forehead. "It's okay, honey. Mama's just going to help." She opened the small black case she'd kept close since boarding. Inside was a compact medical kit, neatly organized with professional precision. She stood up, adjusted her jacket, and began walking down the aisle. The millionaire blinked in disbelief, watching her pass him with steady steps. He wanted to say something, maybe a sarcastic remark about her trying to act important, but the words caught in his throat. The woman's face had changed, her calm had become command. There was no hesitation in her stride, no trace of fear. Passengers turned to watch her as she walked, whispering among themselves. "Is she a doctor?" one man asked softly. "I think she said she is." Halfway down the aisle, a flight attendant rushed toward her, eyes wide. "Ma'am, do you have medical experience?" she asked quickly, voice trembling. The woman nodded once. "Aviation medical specialist," she replied with quiet authority. For a moment, the attendant just stared, taken aback by the confidence in her tone. Then she turned, gesturing urgently toward the cockpit. "This way, please." The passengers watched as the attendant unlocked the cockpit door and ushered her inside. As the door closed, the cabin seemed to fall silent again. The millionaire sat frozen, staring at the place where she'd just stood. His earlier arrogance now felt heavy, foolish, and out of place. He glanced at her son, who sat clutching his storybook tightly, looking toward the cockpit door with wide eyes but no tears. The boy's trust in his mother was absolute, unshaken. Outside the windows, the sky churned with dark clouds, lightning flashing faintly in the distance. The plane still trembled, but something deeper had shifted inside that cabin. The same woman he had mocked for not belonging in first class had just walked into the most critical place on the plane. While the millionaire sat frozen by fear, she had risen without hesitation to face the unknown. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his earlier words echoing painfully in his head. People should really know their place. For the first time, he realized that she did know hers, and it was far above anything he could have imagined. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was thick with panic. The captain's face was ashen, sweat glistening on his forehead as he slumped in his seat, gasping weakly for air. The co-pilot's hands trembled as he flipped through a checklist, his voice breaking as he spoke into the radio. "Mayday! Captain incapacitated, requesting medical assistance!" But there was no time to wait for ground support. The woman who had quietly stepped forward from the cabin now stood at the doorway, assessing the chaos with sharp, steady eyes. "Move aside," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for question. The co-pilot blinked, startled by the calm authority in her voice, but he obeyed instantly. She knelt beside the captain, her movements swift and precise. "Check his vitals and lower altitude to 25,000 feet, she ordered without hesitation. The co-pilot's hand moved to the controls as if her words were an official command. She unzipped her small medical kit and took out an oxygen mask, fitting it over the captain's face with practiced ease. Her fingers pressed against his neck, counting the sluggish beats of his pulse. "Pulse weak, breathing irregular," she murmured, her mind already calculating possibilities. She scanned the cockpit's limited space, spotting a water bottle and asking curtly, "Sterile?" When the co-pilot nodded, she used it to clean an injection port and prepared a small vial from her kit. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing was even. The tension in the air bent toward her steadiness, as if the entire cockpit began to follow her rhythm. The co-pilot, still glancing nervously between her and the flight path, stammered, "Ma'am, are you military?" She didn't even look up as she injected the medication into the captain's arm. "Consultant?" she replied quietly, her voice low but commanding. "U.S. Air Force Aviation Medicine." The co-pilot froze for a moment, recognition dawning on his face. He'd heard of specialists like her, doctors trained not just to save lives, but to handle emergencies thousands of feet above the ground, where precision meant survival. His respect for her deepened instantly. In the cabin behind the locked cockpit door, the passengers whispered among themselves, craning their necks to see. "What's happening up there?" one man asked. "I think the captain's sick." "And that woman, the one with the little boy, she went in there," another said, disbelief lacing his voice. The millionaire sat stiffly, his face pale. He could hear fragments of conversation, the rising murmurs of curiosity, and something deep in his chest tightened. "She's a doctor?" he muttered under his breath, the weight of his earlier mockery pressing down on him. He looked at her son, who sat quietly gripping his toy car, his small eyes fixed on the cockpit door with pure faith. The boy didn't fidget or cry. He just waited, certain that his mother would make everything okay. Minutes passed like hours. The turbulence began to subside, but the tension inside the plane only grew thicker. Then, through the narrow crack in the cockpit door, a few attendants caught sight of movement. The black mother was leaning close to the captain, speaking to him softly, her hand on his wrist. His eyes fluttered open. Relief washed through the crew like a wave. "He's responding," she said calmly, tightening the oxygen mask around his face. The co-pilot exhaled shakily, a small, nervous smile forming for the first time since the crisis began. "We're steady at 25,000 feet, he said. "Vitals are improving," the captain blinked, trying to focus his eyes. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was hoarse but grateful. "Thank you, Doctor," he whispered. She nodded once, giving a faint smile before standing up to check the instrument panel. "You're going to be fine," she assured him. Then, turning to the co-pilot, she added, Maintain this altitude until his condition stabilizes. Then contact medical at Heathrow for a ground response team. Her voice was clear, calm, and completely in control. The co-pilot looked at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You just saved his life," he said quietly. She didn't answer, just gathered her tools, wiped her hands, and stepped back toward the door. Before she could exit, he spoke again, this time into the intercom, his voice carrying through every corner of the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, the relief evident in his tone, "we'd like to thank one of our passengers, Dr. Williams, for saving the life of our captain." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then applause erupted. It started with a few hesitant claps, but within seconds the entire cabin was filled with the sound of cheering, gratitude, and awe. The attendants smiled through tears and passengers turned to each other in disbelief. The millionaire sat frozen, his hands clasped together tightly. His chest burned with shame as he watched her emerge from the cockpit, standing tall and composed. The same woman he'd looked down on hours ago now walked past him with quiet dignity, her face illuminated by the cabin lights, her presence commanding more respect than any title or fortune ever could. He lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. The weight of his arrogance hung over him like a storm cloud. Around him, people whispered about her courage, her skill, her calm. She stopped only to kneel beside her son, brushing a hand over his curls as he smiled up at her. "Did you help the captain, Mama?" he asked softly. "Yes, baby," she whispered, her voice gentle again. "He's going to be just fine." The applause continued as she returned to her seat, but she didn't bask in it. She simply buckled her belt, took her son's hand, and rested back in silence. The millionaire stared out the window, the reflection of the clouds blurring behind the glass. The sound of clapping filled his ears, but all he could hear was his own voice from earlier echoing in his mind, those cruel, careless words about who belonged in first class. Now, sitting beside a woman who had just saved the lives of everyone on that plane, he realized what true class really looked like. When the plane finally touched down on the runway, a wave of relief swept through the cabin. The passengers who had been silent for hours began to breathe again, exchanging nervous laughter and grateful smiles. Outside, flashing lights from ambulances painted streaks of red and white across the night as paramedics waited near the jet bridge. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and flight attendants guided everyone to stay seated while the medical team entered. The captain, now conscious but weak, was carefully lifted from his seat by the paramedics. Before they could wheel him away, he raised a trembling hand and gestured toward the woman standing quietly by the aisle. "Wait," he said hoarsely. "Before I go, I want to thank the doctor who kept me alive." All eyes turned toward her, the modestly dressed black mother who had once been ridiculed by the man sitting a few rows behind her. She stepped forward humbly, her son clutching her hand. The captain reached out, and she took his hand firmly, the respect between them unspoken but deep. "You saved not just me," he said softly, "but every soul on this plane." She gave a gentle nod. "Just doing what I was trained to do," she replied, her tone calm and professional. The paramedics carried him away, and she turned back toward her son, who was watching her with wide, proud eyes. "Mama," he whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Were you the hero?" She smiled faintly, brushing a curl from his forehead. "No, baby," she said quietly. "We just did what we were meant to do." He smiled back, his small hand finding hers again. The innocence in his eyes reflecting everything she stood for, strength without arrogance, compassion without expectation. As they prepared to disembark, the once arrogant millionaire stood near the aisle, his expensive suit now wrinkled, his confidence replaced by a heavy, unfamiliar humility. He hesitated before speaking, his voice softer than it had ever been. "Ma'am," he began, clearing his throat, "I owe you an apology." She turned to face him, her expression neutral, calm. "I misjudged you," he continued, guilt thick in his words. "I said things I shouldn't have. I'm truly sorry." There was no defensiveness in his tone now, no superiority, only genuine remorse. She looked at him steadily, her eyes kind but firm. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said quietly. You just needed to be kind. The words hit him harder than any lecture could have. He lowered his gaze, unable to respond, his throat tightening with regret. As she turned away, her son slipped his small fingers into hers, and together they walked toward the exit, the applause from fellow passengers rising once more. This time, the clapping wasn't just for her skill, it was for her grace, her strength, and the quiet dignity that needed no title to shine. The camera of life seemed to linger on the millionaire's face. His proud posture was gone, replaced by reflection and shame. He stood there long after the applause faded, watching her disappear down the aisle, his mind replaying every cruel word he had spoken earlier. The irony stung him. The woman he had mocked for not belonging had just been the reason he was still breathing. Hours later, as dawn broke over the city skyline, news channels around the world flashed the same headline: Black Doctor Saves Pilot Mid-Flight. The story spread across every screen, social media, television, and radio. Her face appeared calm and composed as the news anchor described how she had saved a life thousands of feet above the ground. In her brief interview, she simply said, "I was just doing my duty." Anyone in my position would have done the same. No self-praise, no pride, just humility. Across town, the millionaire sat in his high-rise office, staring out the massive glass windows that overlooked the city. His coffee had gone cold, the television muted, but her words echoed in his mind like a quiet truth that refused to fade. He remembered the look in her eyes when she said, "You just needed to be kind." He thought about how quick he had been to judge, how easy it had been to look down on someone without knowing their story. For the first time in years, he felt small, but not in a way that hurt his ego. It was the kind of smallness that comes before growth, before understanding. He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the city below, and finally whispered to himself, "Real class isn't measured in money. It's measured in character." The weight of those words settled in the air. Heavier than any dollar he'd ever earned. Somewhere far away, the doctor and her son walked hand in hand through the airport terminal, unnoticed by most, but leaving behind a lesson that lingered in every heart that had shared that flight. She had not lectured or scolded. She had simply lived her truth, with quiet strength and compassion that spoke louder than words ever could. Moral of the story: never judge someone by their appearance, background, or social status. A person's true worth isn't found in what they wear or how much they own. It's found in their heart, their courage, and how they choose to treat others when it truly matters.